Uploading. Okay. Well, I posted the document. For some reason, it's not letting me upload it here into the chat, but I posted it to the WhatsApp group. If anybody needs it, maybe somebody could download it and then upload it from their computer into the chat for everybody. If anybody else wants it, if not, I'll make it available later. Okay. Okay, so welcome again, everybody. I posted the documents to the WhatsApp groups, so you should be able to download them there if you want them. You don't need them right now, but if you want to follow along, I have posted both a link to the Mimer and to, okay, thank you for posting that. And let me also grab a link to the Mimer. I'll put that in the chat in case anybody needs the link to the Mimer. So, and then, yeah, if you can post the second document too, that would be super. Okay, so let me first start off with my story, how this came to be. So my name is Rabbi Binyamin Walters, and I became very interested in Chassidus from a young age. And I was fortunate enough growing up in Pittsburgh to learn Shari Yichud from a very young age with Rabbi Yossi Markel there. And so I spent a long time learning it and teaching it. And but you know, as I was working on it, it was hard for me to figure out how to actually take what it was talking about and turn that into a Hisbonenus in the style that he's describing there of making a yichud. So I spent a long time working and trying, you know, to work out what it was. And then there was a certain point where I felt that I had a big breakthrough, and that was learning Kuntres and Yonesh Yataras Chassidus and realizing that the structure that is described there really gives sort of a template for the type, it's an example of, and it's a template for the type of yichud Hisbonenus that's being described in Shar HaYichud by the Mittler Rebbe. And you know, there are some sources for this type of Hisbonenus and how to do it. It talks a little bit about it in the Zayar and Parshas Hazinu. It talks about it in, you know, in a few places, but there's not a lot of places where it talks about it. So let's see. There's not a lot of places where it talks about it. So, and there weren't a lot of people that were doing it or teaching it, if anybody really. So it was very hard to try to figure it out. So I can't promise that what I'm teaching is for sure what the Mittler Rebbe, exactly what he has in mind, but it's definitely something that is very, has been very fruitful for me. It's helped me now the way I learn a Mimer or a sicha, being able to turn it into a form of Hisbonenus, which I believe fits very well with that form, what he's describing there, and it transforms, you know, for me, a Mimer and a sicha from what might just be something, a simple idea, to a really rich thing. I really describe it as like mining it. You could just get the surface. Maybe if you live in a place that's very rich with a certain resource, you might find coal or gold or whatever just lying at the surface. But if you dig deep down and there's a big mine, you can get unlimited treasures. And so there's really unlimited treasure to be mined in every Mimer and every sicha and all these works. And what we're going to be doing here, I think you also find some precedent, for example, in the works of the Frierdiker Rebbe now. Some of them are published where the Frierdiker Rebbe, his notes and how he went about learning some of these Maimarim and Svarim when he was younger is, I think, very similar to what we're going to be doing. And again, it's mainly based on the template described in Kuntres and Yonesh Yataras Chassidus and seeing how that together with what's described in Shar Yichud, putting the two together, the Shar Yichud from the Mittler Rebbe. So if you haven't learned Kuntres and Yonesh Yataras Chassidus, which is translated into English on the essence of Chassidus, learn it 100 times. You'll never get to the end of everything that's in there. And we do have shiurim on it that are posted on that WhatsApp group, and that new app has them on there. So you could go back and take a look at those. There's also a really nice translation with nice notes. But I just want to give a little overview here of kind of what it describes there. And then we're going to apply it to a Mimer. I picked this Mimer not for any particular reason other than that it has to do with this time of year. It's a Hanukkah Mimer. It's about Zeis Hanukkah, the last day of Hanukkah. and it's pretty short. So hopefully we can get through it and then see how to apply it. We might have to finish this in a second session, but we'll see how far we can get. So the basic idea of what we're trying to do in a yichud style Hisbonenus, we're trying to put everything together and trace an idea from the bottom, from our physical world, and go up the Seder Shtaushalus, from Asiya to Yetzira to Bria to Atzilus, and then through the general worlds, all the way up until the Atzmos, to God's essence before the Tzimtzum, and then come back down and take that new awareness and see how that comes back down into each level. And the whole point of doing that is that we want to reveal the essence. And like it talks about there, the idea of recognizing that God's essence is something that exists outside of and has this value that's beyond anything within the world. It's not defined or confined or described just within terms of the world. It's really something higher than it. And that's the idea that it's an essence. And it's expressed in these two ways, that it transcends in as far as its relationship to the world. It's expressed in two ways, that it transcends everything in the world and that it pervades everything in the world. So that's the basic idea of like what happens whenever you reveal the essence. You recognize something that's beyond the world, and then you recognize how that relates both in a transcendent and a pervading way to everything in the world. Once you reveal the essence, so it elevates everything. And so this is, like the Rebbe gives an example on numerous levels in Kodesh Yonos Chassidus, how, for example, Chassidus elevates our Avodah in 4 different ways. The idea of reawakening us to, rekindle our passion in serving Hashem, to do things beyond the letter of the law with Behidr, doing it in a beautiful way, to have a harmony between our godly soul and our animal soul, and so that they're not in opposition anymore, and to be able to understand godliness. So those are like 4 transformations that happen, for example, in our Avodah, that he talks about there. 4 transformations that happen, that Mashiach, which is the idea of this essence, will bring to the world. There's the idea of just freedom, liberation, that knowledge will be spread. Everybody will have great knowledge and wisdom, especially knowledge of God. The nature of the world will change with different miracles, and godliness will be revealed in the world also. And then he talks about also how these levels correspond in our soul in each of us. So we have the 4 levels of Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, and Chaya, which corresponds to like action, emotion, understanding, and our inner desire, or also our faith. Amunah, and then Bechida is our essence that's higher than that, which is expressed at just our inner godly identity, and it's expressed sometimes also in Mesiras Nefesh, and how that elevates all of those 4. Talks about how Chassidus elevates the 4 levels of Torah, the Pshat, Emes, Drush, Side, the simple meaning, the hinted meaning, which the Rebbe says is what's talking about the outside world, maybe kind of like, more related to science even, and things like that. Drush relates to Torah and mitzvahs, or like morality, and then Side relates to godliness and spheros. So Chassidus is going to elevate our understanding of all of those 4. So that's something that we're going to see throughout this. And then we're going to see how this essence not only elevates our understanding of each of these 4, but it also unites them and shows an underlying theme that harmonizes all 4 of those levels. And then we're going to also see how this essence is something that's found within everything. So the essence not only elevates these 4 lower levels, but it not only does it give room, allow them to exist and not negate them, it's actually found within them, and it allows them to exist. So the essence, even though at first we seem to be elevating to a higher level, each of these 4, but then we're going to come back and like allow them to exist more in their original state, but with the essence still there. And so we're going to basically bring this awareness of the essence back down into like from kind of going from a yichud law perspective, which is that elevated perspective, back down to yichud tata, to a lower, more worldly perspective, maybe to still see how the essence is there, how God is found, the godliness is found there. And then the final thing that we're going to see in like any Hisbonenus is how the essence is really only revealed through and for when it's being brought out to the lowest thing. And so this is the idea, for example, of Hafatzas Mayanos, that the real essence of Chassidus is only revealed and expressed when it's brought to the outside. So within each of us, that means when we're affecting our animal soul and overcoming challenges from our Yitzhahara, for example, when we're breaking it to the outside world and dealing with darkness and things like that, that's where what causes and triggers this essence to be revealed within those lower 4. So that's the idea. And so in doing this type of Hisbonenus, we could have like a basic model for a basic Hisbonenus, like it talks about in Sharifa. There's a more general Hisbonenus and a more detailed Hisbonenus. So the more general idea is just to see in every Mimer, every sicha, there's a certain theme. Usually that theme contains 2 opposites that are in conflict. And then the Mimer or sicha will show us how we will begin by looking at how, with certain assumptions, which is like a worldly view of that thing, without Torah, without Hasidus, how we would look at this idea. And then it's going to show us a paradigm shift to look at it from a higher, more godly view. And then we're going to come back down into our original worldly view, but bringing that godly, higher godly view into it and reaching this new harmony that allows us to, because we're not always going to be in this higher godly state, we're not always going to see things that way, but we can bring something back down with us. And this structure really follows what's called like the 3-act story structure. So most like stories, books, plays, movies, follow this structure. And really, because this is the structure, is just how people learn and grow. This is the story of like our lives, is that we're constantly undergoing this structure. There's a lot of books that are written about this topic, the hero's journey, for example, and things like that. So, I just see that correlation there. And this is the idea that, a hero or a person, they start out in a mundane world. They have a certain flaw. They have a certain misbelief, a misunderstanding about the world, but really mainly a misunderstanding about themselves and who they are and what gives them value. Usually it's the idea that they think that they need something to be valuable or to be important, which is not true. Then the hero goes to some new world or new situation, and they learns this deep truth, which corrects their misbelief. And then finally, the hero returns back to the ordinary world, changed, and is able to bring change to the world around them now that they have this deeper insight into who they really are. So that's the basic structure of like every good story. And this is really the reason that that's the structure of a good story, because this is the structure of how we learn and change and grow in our lives. So that's the basic thing, that you can just take any Mimer or sicha and try to look at in this way and learn it well, and then say, okay, what was the theme? How did I look at it before this topic or this theme before I learned this? How do I look at it now afterwards? What's the paradigm shift? And how does it really harmonize those two views and put them back together? So then there's kind of the more advanced model, which is once we have this basic structure and this basic paradigm shift, we see how does that paradigm shift specifically change our perspective on all 4 of these levels. Like we mentioned in Kodesh Stars of Hasidus, whether it's the 4 levels of the Tyrab, Shavuot, Jasad, the 4 levels of our soul, or all of these things, we're going to see this change happening on, or corresponding to the 4 worlds, Asi, Yitzir, Bir, and Atzilos. We're going to see this shift, the same theme, but how it's applied on these different aspects, different layers of reality, different parts of ourselves. And so we're going to start viewing the theme on all 4 levels, first from the worldly perspective. We're going to see this first shift where Hasidus is going to introduce a new higher paradigm. We're going to explore how this shifts our perspective on all 4 of those levels. So we're going to see individually in a more pratistic, more individual way how it changes each of those 4. Then we're going to have a second shift where we discover that the ultimate thing is actually can be found below, and we're going to bring that higher perspective back down to earth in each of these 4 layers of reality. So that's the basic idea. And then the process, and like there's a Hayemim that talks about the idea of how Hisbonenus has 3 parts. There's a Hisbonenus when you're studying, learning the idea. Then there's after you learned it, before davening, there's a Hisbonenus you do to focus on the highest, the life of the idea. And then there's a third Hisbonenus, which is during davening, which is focusing on the godliness. And so here we're kind of going to try to go through these. Thank you for that. And so the first thing we're going to do is, which is most of the work in a certain way, the preparation to really mine the Mimer and sicha, is do this Hisbonenus of study. And I broke this down into 10 parts. We're going to take the Mimer, we're going to study it, then we're going to map it out by making a point-by-point summary. We're going to identify the main point or theme and try to find this 3-act structure that's there. Then that's going to give us that kind of general Hisbonenus. Then we're going to try to dig down deeper and identify as many pairs in conflict as we can in that Mimer and try to match those up to the 4 stages. And I have a template down at the bottom for that. Then we're going to find, make sure we're aware of the shifts that divide the Mimer or the sicha into these 3 parts, and kind of map out the function of each chapter so we can see the progress. And then we're going to apply those shifts to each of the 4 stages. First, the first shift, which is elevating all of the 4, which is like the Ratzah, bringing them all to a higher godly perspective. Then we're going to see how that new godly essence unites all of those 4, because at first they don't seem to be so connected. And then we'll see the second shift, which is this shuv, this descent, how that comes into all 4 and brings them all back down to earth, bringing that higher awareness with them. And then finally, the idea of how the essence is really only revealed specifically when it comes down into the lowest level or into the outside. And then we'll look into how we can apply this, in our life, see examples of this paradigm shift in different areas, both in general and for each of the four, try to find different examples of them. And then hopefully we can actually even take some actions that reflect that, which is when you really experience it and when you really understand the idea is when you get to see, oh, I could do this differently in my life and actually make those changes. And then you really experience that kind of, shift. And the final thing is that once we really understood it and started living it and experiencing it in this deeper way, then we get this kind of a godly perspective where it gives us this sense of humility and awe and wonder that we really see that there's this idea is something that's much bigger than us in our understanding, that's really part of creation. We start to be to see this godly potential in ourselves and in others, and then in action we can actually see how we can be inspired to be a force for change for good and actually help bring this godliness out in the people and the things around us. So that's kind of the idea. Down here I have a basic template for how we're going to match up these pairs, so according to this, this basic idea of the 5 levels and how they are in Torah, what the Rebbe says in Kodesh Hasidus and the Essence of Hasidus, he describes what those correspond to here, and then how those correspond to the worlds too. And then the bottom, I just put a little template if anybody wants. You could like print this out for each like ice or each section or chapter within a Mimer or sicha and just write it out. Now, personally, I usually do this in notebooks. I like to get notebooks and get a nice pen and sit down, and when I have time, write all this out. And for me, it's like a thing of, it's very precious, and I do it like it's like a hiddur mitzvah. I try to get nice notebooks and a nice pen and sit down and decorate the page a little bit even, and spend time. I really and then I get a lot out of it also. And I have quite a number of these. I started writing these out because I felt it was hard to do this all just in my mind, just to sit down and think through it. I found difficult, but when I wrote it out, it helped me go through this process. So I started writing out these working on writing my Hisbonenus before davening, working on what I was learning and things like that. I began doing this when I was about 20, and then it developed from there to be kind of this system that I use now. So now let's jump over to the Mimer. I sent a link to it, or you can have it if you have the Sefer. It's in the new Mimer Malukot Chelik Beis, and it's not too long. So the first step, we're going to follow this template, and like I have over here, step 1 is learn the Mimer, or sicha, if it's a sicha, whatever it is. So I'm going to start off with learning it. Okay. I'm not going to try to get too deep here. And honestly, I mean, I didn't get a chance to spend so much time with this Mimer. There's definitely room after doing this that I would want to go back to it and look up maybe some of the sources and things like that. And you get a lot more richness the more that you work on something and the more that you look at some of the cross references. But I'm going to show you at least, a basic approach that we can start even without going too deep into it. I mean, without doing too much extra research. Okay, so Bayem Hashmi Naslu Bnei Menashe Gamer. On the 8th day, this is speaking about the Nisim, when the Mishkan was originally inaugurated. So there were 7 days when Moshe set up the entire Mishkan, the entire tabernacle. He put it up and he took it down every single day, and he kind of got the Kohanim, Aaron and his sons ready for doing the service. And then the 8th day, which is where Parsha Shemini starts, that was when he handed over the work to Aaron and his sons. They actually began working in the Mishkan, and that's Parsha Shemini is beginning there, the 8th day of the inauguration of the temple, of the original Mishkan. And it says in the Medrash about how there's all kinds of wonderful things that happened that day. It was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and that's the first time that they did the Karbanis there. The Nisim then started bringing special Karbanis for the next 12 days to inaugurate it. And so that was the first time that they started doing that. And we read those parshas of the Nisim on Hanukkah. So on Hanukkah, we read each day like a different Nasi, even though that really happened starting on the 8th day, but that's the way we do the reading of the Torah. So this is a quote from that reading of the Torah, that on the 8th day, the Nasi, and this is the Nasi that we read in Nisan each day in the month for the first 12 days. So on the 8th day was the Nasi of Menashe, and and I'm going to actually make this a little bit bigger, so in case anybody's following along on the screen. And and then we say Zeis Hanukkah Samizbeach, and we say this is the dedication of the Mizbeach. This is the way they inaugurated or originally dedicated the Mizbeach when they were starting the service in the temple. And that's what we read on, this is the Kriyas HaTorah that we read on the 8th day of Hanukkah. Hine yidua deme'atayimim al zeh shebechanukah karim karbonis anasiyim hu lefi shebechanukah chinchu es hamizbeach. So why we generally read something that has to do with the day, the time of the day, or what's going on in the Torah. So the fact that we read about how the Nesiim originally inaugurated the Mizbeach and the Mishkan is because when the Hashmonaim and the Maccabees, when they came to the Beis HaMikdash, they found everything was ruined, everything was defiled, and they had to take out all the idols that were brought into the Beis HaMikdash. They had to clean everything up. They had to, rebuild the Mizbeach because it was damaged and it has to be, proper pure stones and things like that. And they had to fix everything up and rededicate the Mizbeach. So that's why, because it was a time when they re-inaugurated the Mizbeach, they read about how it was inaugurated the first time by the heads of each tribe of the 12 tribes in the desert. So this is parallel or similar or corresponding to how the Mizbeach was inaugurated originally through the Nesiim bringing their sacrifices. They brought special sacrifices that were special one-time deal for those 12 days to inaugurate the Mizbeach. Mizem muvan. So from this, it's understood that there's a certain parallel between the 8 days of Hanukkah and the 8 days of the original inauguration of the Mishkan. Although it's a little bit like, at least my understanding of it, and somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Mishkan was inaugurated by Moshe for 7 days. The 8th day was when it was actually kind of, like I said, it was handed over to Aaron and his sons, and that's when the Nesiim started bringing their inaugural karbanis. They did it for the next 12 days. So it wasn't exact, then it was 8 days plus 12 days. It was kind of this longer thing, but we're comparing Hanukkah to that initial 8-day period, with the 8th day being special. And just like with that original inauguration of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, was divided to these two parts, two periods. There was the first 7 days where Moshe was setting it up and doing everything, and then the 8th day where again he handed it off. Aaron and his sons finally did it. That's when the Shekhinah came down and the cloud rested, and all these the fire came down from heaven for the first time. All kinds of special things happened, and the Nesiim started bringing their karbanos. So it was a very special day. Well, Derech Zehu b'Shmei Shemei Hanukkah, similar thing with the 8 days of Hanukkah. Sheyem Hashmid Hanukkah Nikra al Pi Minhag Yisrael Gam B'Shem B'Fnei Atzmei Zeis Hanukkah. So we find that the 8th day of Hanukkah, just like the 8th day of the inauguration was special, the 8th day of Hanukkah is also considered to be something different, a little bit special. It's called Zeis Hanukkah. It's called This is Hanukkah. The simple reason that we call it Zeis Hanukkah is because when we read the Torah that day, we say Zeis Hanukkah. We read that portion in the Torah. But, we see that it has something special about it. And again, this is the 8th day of Hanukkah. V'yesh Leimar, and the Rebbe says now in parentheses, Shezeu gam masha kriya shebeter b'yem hashmini Hanukkah hi harbe yoser mishivas hayam shelafanav. This is also hinted at in the fact that the Torah reading on the 8th day of Hanukkah is much longer than the Torah reading of the other 7 days. The b'shivas yom harishonim karim b'chol yom rak shnei nesim v'yem hashmini Hanukkah karim chamisha nesim v'gam zeis Hanukkah samizbeach v'reish parshas ba'aleis chasaneres. But on the 8th day of Hanukkah, every other day of Hanukkah, we just read how 2 of the 12 princes of the leaders of the tribes brought their sacrifice. But on the 8th day of Hanukkah, we read how 5 of the last 5, because we do the first 8 days, we keep repeating it. And then on the 8th day, we read the last 5, plus we read the entire, it gives us sum total of all the sacrifices days. So we read that, and we also read the beginning of Parshas Ba'aleischa of how Aaron started lighting the menorah. The fact that we add on and we read the Torah, we read these extra parts of the Torah, shows that it's something, it's a special day. And it's so now in Chassidus it's explained in the Mimer of the Alter Rebbe Baruch Shas Anisim with the notes of the Tzemach Tzedek, that the 8th day, both of the inauguration of the Mishkan and the 8th day of Hanukkah, both represent Malchus. The Lachain Nikra b'Shem Zeis Hanukkah ki Zeis hi Malchus. That's why it's called Zeis Hanukkah, because we find throughout Kabbalah and Chassidus that Zeis represents Malchus. Zeh is the masculine form of saying this, and Zeis is the feminine form of saying this. And generally, Zer Anpin is considered masculine, is represented by Zeh, and Malchus is described as feminine, is represented by Zeis. So that's the first ice. Section 2, chapter 2 of the Mimer. Beis v'hina yidua, it's known. To be shmini shnei and yonim, that the idea of 8 has two ideas, two themes that it represents. Sheshmini hu l'mayla me'ashiva shelafonov al derech hapirish ba'oisiyos tetevas oz aleph reichev al zayin. And one explanation is that 8 represents something that's higher than the 7 that preceded it, represents the 7, like very often we talk about 7 represents the 7 days of the week, represents the order of nature, and 8 represents something that's higher than nature and beyond the 7. The Shiva, Haim, Shiva, Samides, Ushmini, Hubina, that the 7 represents the 7 Mides, and 8 represents Bina. So that's one way that we commonly find the relationship of 7 and 8. We find another one, sometimes it says that 8 represents Malchus that's lower than the 7 Mides. And the same thing when it comes to the 8th day of the inauguration in the Likutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe brings both explanations. So there it says, in the Alter Rebbe says 2 explanations, that the 8th day of the inauguration of the temple, the original Mishkan, had one explanation is that the 7 days represent the midas of Bina, and that the 8th day represents Chachma that's higher than that. And then there's another explanation, the other explanation is that the 8th day represents Malchus, and how can we put these 2 explanations together? And this is a very common theme we find in Chassidus, and it's like, for example, explained in Perek Chaf Vav in Shari Yichud, that in order to bring something down lower, you have to go higher. And so this is the idea that in order to bring something from Chachma and Bina down into Malchus, to express it in thought, speech, and action, which is the idea of 8 that's lower than the 7, that requires that the source come from somewhere higher, which is the idea of 8 that's higher than 7. So the 2 are connected, and that's the explanation that's given in the Likutei Torah there. And seemingly, we would tend to say and think that the same thing is true about the 8th day of Hanukkah, that it's Malchus, it's lower than the 7, but its source is really higher. It should have also these 2 explanations. The reason that we say that it represents Malchus, which is 8 that's lower than the 7, is because its source is an 8 that's higher than the 7. But we have seemingly a question on this in the Mimer that we mentioned, where it talks about Hanukkah. It only mentions the idea, at least in the beginning of the Mimer, that the 8th day of Hanukkah represents Malchus. It doesn't mention the second explanation. And unlike in the Mimerim about the inauguration, the 8th day of the inauguration, where there it says 2 explanations for 8, that it's Malchus that's lower than 7, and that it's Bina or Chachma that's higher than 7. This implies that in the case of Hanukkah, we don't really have both themes. We just have one theme, the idea of bringing it down to Malchus, bringing the light down to Malchus, as opposed to the idea of also reaching up to the source. So that's kind of a little bit of a question, like why is Hanukkah different than the inauguration, and what does that difference exactly mean? So that's the first step so far in the Mimer. And so now we're going to explain it. And very often the Rebbe in a Mimer or in a sicha will introduce a theme and have some sort of question. And then in order to answer it, we'll have to take a look at some other idea that will then come back and help us answer it. And that's what we're going to do now. Gimel. So we can understand this based on what is known. And we'll understand this by explaining the idea of the unique quality, the superiority that exists in action, which in a person, the idea of action corresponds, which is the lowest faculty in a person, corresponds to the sphere of Malchus. And so we find a few different ways that action is special and superior. Oh, and I forgot to mention before, but I'd like to suggest, everybody, if you could take give a little tzedakah before learning. It's a very good thing to do in general, and especially before learning something Chassidus. So if you can do it now, easily do it. If not, you can pledge in your mind to do it and do it later, at your leisure. So okay, so action in a person corresponds to Malchus. So we're going to first explain the idea of Maisa, and from that we'll understand this idea of Malchus. The idea that specifically through action, it elevates all of the other faculties of the soul. And this is something that we find the Rebbe mentions very often, that the Alter Rebbe says in the Torah, how through doing the actions of the mitzvahs, and especially through helping people and having with Avos Yisrael and tzedakah and things like that, that it makes a person's mind and heart refined 1,000-fold. And that Tzemach Tzedek says it's literal. It would take you 1,000 hours to accomplish in learning or in davening. You'll be able to accomplish in an hour through action. So we see that action elevates all the other kaifes. And there's a famous mashal, the Mitzvah talks about this. I made the Alter also, that from the mashal is a lever. If you want to lift something up with a lever. If you want to lift something up, you have to put the lever underneath. Like if you have, imagine these days you go into a store and they have those forklifts that they use to lift things up. So they have a little pallet, a piece of, this kind of thing of wood that they put underneath the whole thing. And then the forklift grabs onto that and it picks the whole stack up. If you wanted to pick up a stack of things that are not bound together, you have to pick it up from the bottom. Otherwise, you're just going to get the top half, not the whole thing. So this is the idea that you have some sort of device to lift things. You have to lift it from the bottom, and then you lift the entire stack. If you lift it from the middle, you're going to leave the whatever from there and down is going to be left. You're not going to lift it up. For example, if you're going to lift up a house, sometimes they do move houses, especially if they're not such a big house, they'll lift them up and then they'll put them somewhere else, or you can buy prefab houses. Sometimes you see them driving down the highway, and in order to lift something like that, they have to lift it from the bottom, the beams that are at the bottom, that are the floor or the foundation of the house. You have to lift it up from there. If you try to pick up the walls from the middle, then the lower beams would be left below. They wouldn't get picked up, especially if it wasn't all attached and cemented together and framed together and things like that. I don't know exactly how they did construction back then. It could be they just kind of put it down on it. I'm not sure. And but I'd imagine it would be pretty unsafe to try to pick up a house from the middle too. You want to support the weight from the bottom, even these days. And we can say the kivan shekol akayres heim shel bayis echad lachin shekayra tachtein nisharas lamata gam hagba aliyah shel kayres al yainais eina b'shleimus. That because all the parts of the house are meant to function as one unit, if you picked it up from the middle and you left the floor behind, then you didn't really successfully, even the walls and the roof aren't complete, because they can only function properly as a house when the entire house is there. So in order to have a proper, lifting of even the top for it to be considered a house that was successfully lifted, you need the entire thing, even the bottom. Well, achas kam v'kama b'hanimshal t'keichas nefesh, and this is even more so. This is true even more so when it comes to the faculties of a person. Shekol koyach mashpia al shar koyches. That in this case, every one of our faculties is not just receiving from, but it also gives something to all the other ones. So they all need each other. They're all interdependent. In order for to elevate the upper faculties like intellect and emotions, for that to be proper and be complete, you have to start from the very bottom and change your actions. And only when you elevate and change your actions will the intellect and emotions be able to be successfully elevated. If a person just tries to educate, the Rebbe talks about this a lot, that people try to just be educated and sophisticated with intellect and philosophy and science, but they don't teach basic the basic actions of that you need, like the Sheva mitzvahs, or for Jews, all the mitzvahs and things like that. So then we see it can lead to all kinds of depravity. So that's the idea of you need the koyach hamayis, koyach hachit tachtin, and this is also the idea you find that it says derech eretz kadma l'Torah, for example, that the idea of etiquette and things like that, manners has to precede understanding Torah properly, and a lot of things. But inyan bazeh sha'ayidei hamayisa. So that's one idea, that action, because it's the bottom, if you don't pick up the action, it's going to drag everything else down, and it's going to prevent everything else from being complete, because it has to function together as a package deal. And so you have to, you don't want it to be the weakest link in the chain. It's only as good as the weakest link. If you don't elevate the action too, it's going to drag down the intellect and the emotions and things like that. But there's another idea, because that actually it's not just that the action will drag down the upper faculties, but actually by elevating your action, that will also elevate the intellect and emotion to a higher place than they would be able to reach if you didn't have the action. And this is comparable to a balanced scale, where you put a weight on one side, and then you put the things that you want to measure out or weigh out on the other side, and one goes up, one goes down. The more that you weigh down the side that you're using to weigh out your produce or whatever, the lower that goes. That lifts the other side to a higher place. And so in a similar way, when you're trying to relate to and fix up something lower, that's going to automatically elevate the upper side, which is what's like the intellect and emotions that are involved in guiding the action are going to get lifted higher. Or like it talks about the idea of how a teacher, when he has to give a very simple mashal, a very simple metaphor, is going to have to reach much deeper than if he was just understanding it for himself. So we see these two ideas of how action has a certain advantage and is able to lift up and elevate the other kaiches. Dalet, chapter 4. Mihine, zesh al yidei hamayis davka nais shleimes haliyah d'chol kaiches hu lefisha sharish hamayis hu lemaylim mikol kaiches. The real inner reason that action is able to bring perfection and completion to all the other upper faculties is because the source of action is higher than all the other kaiches. Ushnei yonim bazeh, and there's two aspects to this. One, shaham shacha b'maisa, zeh shaseichel midas nimshachem b'maisa, shar shahu b'hanefesh l'maylam ha'kaiches. One is that in order for the intellect and emotions to come down and reach the level of action, requires that they connect to the soul itself that's higher than the kaiches. Because the kaiches, like he's going to say, shaseichel midas mitzan atzvam heim u'bolim, ve'im b'choltem le'er l'matza ki kolkat was lavish maisa, because the nature of the intellect and emotions on their own, they have a certain definition. And intellect just deals with intellectual things. Emotions just deal with emotional things. In order for them to come down and guide and relate to action, that requires, they're not able to do that on their own. They're not capable of coming down so far and going out of their nature so much. The only way that they can come down to action is when something of the soul that sits higher than the intellect and emotion comes into them and says, you're my intellect, you're my emotions, and you're here serving me, and so therefore I need you to come down. I'm gonna, push you to come down and give you the ability to come down. Because the nefesh, the soul, is something that transcends any of the particular kaiches. It's this like soviv type of a level, and therefore it's found in all of the kaiches equally. It's found it's found in the, just like we see this idea of the desire doesn't have a particular local organ, and so therefore it's found in all the body the same, in the mind, in the heart, in the hands, and so that's this expression of the nefesh that's able to connect from one level to another and allow the kaiches to work together. So that's one idea, is that coming down to action requires that something higher than intellect and emotions help plug into the intellect and emotions. So it's connecting the seichel and midas to the nefesh. And there's a second idea, so it's not just that action is lower than the intellect and emotions, and in order for them to get the ability to reach so low, they need this higher power. But actually, action itself has a certain intrinsic value and quality that its source is rooted higher in the nefesh, deeper than any of the other kaiches. And so the action itself is actually higher in its source than intellect and emotions. The fact that the other faculties, the intellect and emotions, are much closer to the soul, in other words, they are happening more within the person, and it's more becomes like just the person expressing themselves, how they think, how they feel, as opposed to action is more the way a person relates to the outside world, and it's something that requires more of an effort, and it's not just this kind of natural outflow. And this is because the other kaiches, the intellect and emotions, are coming from the giluyim of the nefesh, the way that the soul is being revealed and expressed, which is really just a limited aspect. The essence of the soul really transcends this form, but it's either, it's chosen to take on this form, or God gave it this kind of form. It's kind of like the body of the soul, so to speak. It's its expression, but the real essence of the soul is something that's higher, and because it's something higher, it doesn't have a defined form, and that's why it takes kind of more preparation and choice for it to come out, but then actually shows that it's coming from a higher place, from the essence of the soul. Okay, ice, hey. And again, we could spend more time explaining all these things, diving into it, and even, doing some of these footnotes are really nice. I mentioned a few of them in the paper, but for now, I just want to go through the basic idea, and so we can, cover the ground. So, hey, just like in action, the source of action is higher than any of the other kaiches, higher than intellect and emotions. So we have a similar thing in serving Hashem. The greatest quality and the greatest connection to Hashem comes specifically through action, the physical performance of the mitzvahs. This idea that we say it's a dispute in the Talmud, which is greater, to study Torah or to fulfill the mitzvahs. And the halacha is the Talmud Gadol, that these days study is greater because it leads to action. If a person does a mitzvah, that's not going to necessarily lead him to do more things. But if a person studies Torah, that's eventually going to lead them to be able to do the mitzvahs. Both they'll know what to do, and it will inspire them to do it, and things like that. But this idea that we say that Talmud Gadol, that study is primary and supersedes a mitzvah, if the mitzvah can be done by somebody else, better that you should spend your time studying Torah. That's only true these days, in the times of Golus. But in the times of Mashiach, in the time to come, it says that action will be primary. Then the main focus will be on action. And even now in Golus, when we say that study is primary, that's because the reason that's given in the Gemara is because the study will lead you to action. Which shows that really, fundamentally, the ultimate goal and the ultimate, quality comes from the action, and that's what's giving the value to the study. So why, if action is superior, why nowadays do we not say that as the law? Why we now say that study is primary and you should spend your time studying Torah mainly if you have the choice? So the reason for that is two things in general. Generally, there's two ideas. Dugmas shnei inyanim del el sif dalid shebemayla dekaycha ma'is legabe shar kayches, which correspond to those two metaphors we had before in chapter 4 about the superiority of action. One, zeh shamaisa me'erer mamshach es ar habligvul shel maila me'eslabshus b'chachma Talmud. One is the idea that action, just like we said that in the soul, action reveals, in order to bring something down to action, you have to reach into the soul that's higher than intellect and emotions. So too, when we do the physical mitzvahs, that brings out God's infinite light that's higher than Chokhmah, higher than the Seder Shtashlos, higher than even, which is the wisdom that's in the Torah, which is the idea of Talmud. And that's why the godliness is brought out through the physical mitzvahs is able to reach lower and actually the world in a lower and bring it to places that you couldn't do just through Talmud. And like we see in a simple sense, there's many people that aren't able to understand deep things, but they can be very affected from doing simple actions. And then we see that in the Rebbe focuses Mitzvayim and things like that on sorry, I was just if you come in, please, make sure to mute yourself so it won't make noise. We see the Rebbe focused on action, and that was able to reach a lot of people. If you just go out and try to get people to study in yeshiva, you're not going to reach a lot of people in that way. And also within each person, it reaches parts of us that are harder to affect through study and things like that. Shagam achshav ha'ikr hu ha'maisa. No, I'm sorry. Okay, that's the one thing. And the second idea, the second superiority of physical action in Avodas Hashem, there's a second idea that through doing physical mitzvah, for example, we are reaching to the essence of God that's essentially hidden and essentially beyond revelation. And that's higher even than the idea of the infinite light. Even the idea of the infinite light is the highest revelation of God, but there's something that's even beyond that, that's beyond any sort of revelation. V'yesh leimer, the mailes hamaisa achshav, shegam achshav ha'ikr hu hamaisa, but God is a Talmud hu shemeva the maisa kanal. And we can say that the superiority of action today, during Golos, because even now, like we said, the main thing is still maisa, and the greatness of Talmud is that it's meva the maisa. The greatness of studying Torah is that it's going to lead to the performance of the mitzvahs. So today, the main superiority of action is the first superiority. That through doing the actions, that will bring the completion to our understanding of the Torah. That in order to, like we said, that when the Alter Rebbe said that when a person does physical mitzvahs, especially things connected with Avos Yisrael and Tzedakah, that it refines their mind and heart 1,000-fold. So what they'll be able to bring this awareness of God's essence into their studying of Torah, into their Avodas Hashem, and they'll have a proper love and fear of Hashem. And so the main quality of action today is that it brings that perfection to our studying of Torah, to our understanding to the Talmud, which is Shleimus B'nai HaGiluyim. This is the completion and perfection of the Giluyim, of the revelation of godliness within what can be revealed, basically within understanding and feeling. V'zehu Gadol Talmud Shleim Evdei Maisa. And this is the idea that it says, the expression that's brought in the halacha, that now study is superior, is primary because it leads to action. That the superiority of action, the way it's today, is included in the reason for why study is primary. So we see the main focus is the influence that action has on the study. The Talmud that the fact that a person is studying in a way that's going to lead to action, when you study in that way, that's when a person studies basically in a way of halacha l'maisa, where it's practical and it's leading you to actually make real changes in your life through studying it. That type of study, like it talks about, actually, this is one of the main points, for example, in Hemshech Samach Vav. It's a big topic that talks about a lot of places. That the ultimate in studying Torah is when it focuses on action, and when you study in that way, whether it's in halacha or in Hasidus, if you focus on bringing it to actual avodah, actual practical expression in your life, then your understanding is going to be in a much, much deeper way. You'll really get the truth of the idea, really get the godliness of the idea that's beyond what you can normally understand with human intellect. that you bring the infinite light of God into the Torah, into the understanding, which is what allows then your understanding to come down and bring into action. And a simple example of that it says is, for example, when you know it's going to be, when let's say a rabbi is asked a question and he knows that he's going to have to give an answer that's going to influence a person's real life, he gets a deeper level of fear of heaven and humility, and that deeper bittul, that deeper, whatever it is, nullification to God and humility to God is what allows him to then be a vessel for God's light to shine through him. And then it says it's just like the Shekhinah speaking through him. The divine presence is like speaking through him and allows that infinite light of God to come into the understanding and then bring it to action properly. And the idea that in the times of Mashiach and the Gula, that we're going to say the action will be primary, is the second idea that the action itself has an intrinsic essential value that's higher than even its effect on the Talmud. That it's going to connect us to the God's essence, which is essentially hidden, which is essentially higher than understanding, that there's something that we can grasp and connect to through the action that is essentially beyond anything we could ever explain or understand, even in the wisdom of the Torah. Okay, chapter Vav, Eis Vav, chapter 6. V'hine Yedua sheb'Chanukah la'achrei hisgavrus ha'cheshech di'avanim. So now back to our original theme of Hanukkah. Now that we talked about this idea of Maisa and Talmud, we're going back to the original idea of Hanukkah and how it's different than the inauguration of the temple when it was originally inaugurated by Moshe and Aaron in the desert. So on Hanukkah, it was the rededication of the temple that we're celebrating Hanukkah is after the darkness and oppression of the Yevonim, whatever, whatever you want to call it, the Greeks or whoever it was. So in Hanukkah, they brought a new revelation of godliness into the Beis Mikdash and into the world that was higher than what was accomplished by the Beis Mikdash up until this point. And the proof is that the level of godliness that was brought into the world before this point, it was possible for it to be darkened, to be extinguished by the oppression and the influences of the Yevonim. But the light of Hanukkah was a higher light, which is coming from what's called Havayah D'Le'ela, the higher name of Hashem, which transcends the entire creation. And this light is something that can even enlighten the darkness. It can even shine. It can shine into the darkness to the point where it even caused the darkness itself to shine. The Havaya, the Taisvis Vav, like it says, that and Hashem will brighten my darkness. There's a pasuk in Tehillim. And the fact that it says it with the extra Vav indicates that it's this higher level of Hashem's name that transcends the entire creation. And that is able to bring light even into the darkness and actually transform the darkness itself to light. That the darkness itself should shine. The Dugmas Hagili D'Lasalavi, which is similar, so the revelation that was accomplished in Hanukkah was similar to the revelation that will happen in the times of Mashiach and the times of the Gula. And so we see that Hanukkah actually has a certain superiority. And now we can explain the difference between the 8th day of Hanukkah to the 8th day of the inauguration of the temple. The idea that we said that the inauguration of the temple originally has an idea of 8 as being Malchus that's lower than the 7 Midas. There, in the inauguration of the temple, was that there was a revelation of godliness that was coming from a higher place, and it came all the way down into Malchus. But through in Hanukkah, the idea of the 8th day of Hanukkah is the fact that corresponds to Malchus is not we're saying that the higher light is being brought all the way down to Malchus. We're saying that through the revelation that's happening on Hanukkah, we're elevating Malchus itself, and we're revealing the source of Malchus itself. And that's why it only the Zehu, and this is the reason why Shabbat Droshim Shemavarim Inin Shmeinis Yimam Muvayim Shnei Pirush Nishmi. And so in the Mimerim of the Alter Rebbe and Tzalmud Tzedek, when it talks about the idea of the 8th day of the theme of 8 in terms of the inauguration of the Mishkan originally, There we have two explanations. The idea shulamayla mishiva v'shulamat mishiva, that 8 represents something that's higher than the 7 and lower than 7. But in this Mimer we mentioned previously of the Alter Rebbe that discusses Hanukkah, it only mentions the idea that 8 is something that's lower, is malchus that's lower than 7. Because the idea of that something higher is being brought down into malchus lower than in 8, it's lower than 7, like it is in the case of the inauguration. That is that first superiority of action that we talked about, which is like the superiority of action now in Gullus, where it's able, by bringing something down, when studying in a way that you're bringing it down to action, you're able to get a deeper understanding, bring godliness into the Torah. Shmini Shlamayla Mishiva, which is the idea of 8 that's higher than 7. But the ability to actually refine and elevate the lower thing itself, Shmini the Hanukkah, which is the theme of the 8th day of Hanukkah, that Malchus itself, the action itself was elevated. This is revealing this essential hidden, the essential hiddenness of God's essence that's essentially higher even than the source of revelation. So it's not a higher revelation coming down, it's revealing that God's essence is really found even in the lowest place to begin with. This is the idea of the superiority of action that will be revealed in the times of Mashiach, in the times of the Gula. And that's why on the 8th day of Hanukkah we emphasize that it's Malchus, and we call it Zeis Hanukkah, because we're emphasizing that it's the idea of refining the lower aspects of the world, whether it's Malchus, whether it's action, and things like that, or the darkness of Gullus itself. Okay, so now the final chapter, Zion, chapter 7. But Inyan zeh shel asalavi yia ma'isa gadol nisgala k'chol inyan v'taras hachsidus b'deres achreim daka. This idea that in the times of the Gula, action will be superior to Talmud is something that was revealed and explained, like everything in Chassidus, specifically in recent times, in later generations. But tam shagilu lanu zeh afsha achshav halacha shetalmud gadol. And seemingly, why did the Rebbeim need to tell us this? Why was this explained to us that in the future action will be superior? If now, in times of Gullus, the halachas remain, the Talmud is gadol, that the primary thing is study. So why do they tell us that in the future it's going to be different? And which is by the way connected to the idea that then the halacha will be like Beis Shammai and things like that. Because, and this is a theme that the Alter Rebbe mentions, and the Rebbe repeats very, very often, it's very central to the Rebbe's message about Mashiach. Everything that's going to happen, all the revelations and all the changes that are going to happen in the world, in the Geula, in the times of Mashiach, all depend on us and our actions now. We have to be the catalysts that initiate those changes. It's not just like when a teacher has a marble jar, when it gets full, you get a prize. It's not like we're doing something and once we do enough, then Hashem is going to bring the Geula. We have to do things that are specifically leading to and planting the seeds and being the catalyst to cause those changes to happen. And then yes, Hashem will do a lot of the things for us, but we need to at least take the kind of actions and steps that's going to initiate that. And so we need to now, because we're getting so close to the Gula, we need to start making certain shifts and changes to make that change happen. And so in order for in the time to come, in the times of Mashiach, that action, the superiority of action should be realized, requires that now we make certain efforts and put certain emphasis on the idea of action now. Therefore, in the times, the generation right before Mashiach, it was revealed to us that in the time to come, action will be superior. To give us this extra push and extra encouragement to really focus and really be meticulous and about action. And through this, we will accomplish that very soon we'll have this revelation of the Gula where mice will be gadol. We'll appreciate that and it will be, actualized. And since in the time of the Gula action will be superior, Hare muvan shekol ha'inyanim de gula hasida u'makol shkein gula atzma tzrichim liyais b'maisa payol. And therefore, certainly everything relating to the gula, and certainly the gula itself, have to be things that happen in action. They can't just be theories. They can't just be ideas. They have to be practical, physical realities. And as long as we don't have the actual physical gula, we're missing the main thing, even if we have it spiritually. Ukasipur hayadua to Tzemach Tzedek v'Ad Marash, like the famous story of Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash. Shekisha Amar Tzemach Tzedek b'negei la'kates shehoya al shnas Tafrei Shches shezen is kaimai dedikutei Torah. So it was written in certain svarim that in the year Tafrei Shches was a kates, one of these times it was predicted that Mashiach would come, and unfortunately it didn't actually come. But Tzemach Tzedek said that kates was expressed in the fact that Likutei Torah was printed in that year. So he told this to his son, and about this, the Rebbe Marash said to him, Ana Admar Marash, Men darf have Mashiach l'mata me'asar tvachim. We need to have Mashiach lower than 10 tvachim. We need to have it physically. The simple meaning is we have to have it physically in the physical world, although the expression of l'mata me'asar tvachim is actually, it says that the Shechina wouldn't come lower, like at Har Sinai and things that didn't come down. It came down to the world, but didn't come lower than 10 tvachim. And it's explained in Chassidus and Kabbalah, the idea of the 10 tefachim represents the 10 spheros of Klippas Noiga. And that's the idea that it only came down to the realms of holiness, but didn't come all the way down into like the Klippas, into like the outside world that opposes godliness. And so I think that's very connected to the theme here, and in many places, that the idea of bringing Mashiach down, L'mata me'asar tefachim, means both that it should be physical, but also that it should be something that's, permeating the darkness itself and transforming the Klippa itself. And we can say, so why did Tzemach Tzedek then, even say this? Obviously, Tzemach Tzedek also, understood this idea that Mashiach has to actually come physically. The reason that he said this is, like Baal Shem Tov said in his famous letter, he was told by Mashiach that through spreading the wellsprings of Chassidus outside, bringing this idea of bringing godliness out, which is corresponding to this idea of bringing it to L'mata me'asar tefachim. So then Mashiach comes, that brings Mashiach. The kivin shepnimis haTorah ma'inasecha hi l'mayla me'egbolas hazman. And since the idea of pnimis haTorah, the mayonis are something that's higher than time. Hare move on to yeshna hafatzas mayonis hasiba la'asimar yeshna miyad gam hamasubav asimar. That since Chassidus is inherently higher than time, as soon as you have this idea of hafatzas mayanis, which is what causes Mashiach to come, you right away have Mashiach. In things that exist within the realm of time, so then the cause and effect happen first, the cause, and then only later the effect. Because the effect is something that descends and is like a chain reaction from the cause. And when you have a cause and effect relationship, it can be in many ways. It can be very quick, like it says that God's words, that when he says something, it happens immediately. Like it says about Mashiach, the Mashiach can come, very quickly. Or it can come in a slower way, and it's like it says Mashiach can come in its time, which means that it would be a slower process. But something in spiritual things that are higher than time, it's not possible to have any delay between the cause and effect. So as soon as you have the cause, you immediately have the effect. So spiritually speaking, as soon as a person learns Chassidus in a way of hafatzas mayanos, or teaches Chassidus in a way of hafatzas mayanos, they immediately have Mashiach. At least you have the spiritual aspect of Mashiach. But this is in the essential idea of hafatzas mayanos and Mashiach, where they're higher than time. But which is again this higher aspect of it. But the ultimate perfection of spreading Chassidus and bringing Mashiach is when they come down within the realm of time and space. And within action itself, which should come lower than 10 tefachim, which again hints the idea of coming all the way down even to the klippa. and in simple terms, through our actions, to do a mayanas in actual action. Through that, we should bring Mashiach in actuality. The kivan de zesh tzarich l'chakes l'bias Mashiach noisav al ham l'bias Mashiach l'chakes is, and the fact that we're instructed, we're obligated to eagerly await for Mashiach, not just to believe he's going to come. Hu halacha, this is a halacha that's brought down by the Rambam. Din yonish halacha hu l'chol l'reish kiyama inin k'meishu b'pashas, and in halacha, the main thing is, at least, the first primary thing has to be doing what it says. All the kavanis and the inner feelings and understanding behind it is secondary. The main thing is to do it. Reminds of pile, and the main thing is should be done physically. Lochein beheskem kol hakol viva Mashiach now b'mehera mina mamash. Therefore, with the agreement of everybody, we're going to announce we want Mashiach now. Should be speedily in our days mamash. Amen. So that's the Mimer, and it's obviously a beautiful Mimer, and that itself, even just this hashkafa rishena, this girsa level of learning, is a tremendously powerful and amazing thing. But now let's see what happens when we go through the other steps of the process and, like I said, mine it and see what we can get out of it, and hopefully we'll get something that's even, appreciate this idea in a much deeper way, in a more transformative way. So when I did this second step, usually I have the paper there, and then next to me I'll have my notebook. In this case, I opened up the Mimer on one side of my screen, and I wrote it out on the other side of the screen. But I think it'll be a little hard for you to see it that way, and I'm gonna try to do it so a little bit more quickly. So I'm not going to go, side by side again. This time I'm just going to go through it. Yeah, I'd have to check which one it is in the old Mimer. It was given out, the Mimer was given out in let's see, it was given out in Tafshin Nun. So that means it's probably in Chelik Daled, but you'd have to check because the order of those Mimer of the old version is the time when it was given out. So the later years are later. Okay. So let's go through this. So what I'm going to do now is, this is again, like what I did was I took the Mimer and I read through the Mimer again. But I'm not going to do that whole process exactly with you, but I read through the Mimer again, and I went and I wrote a summary of each point of the Mimer. And, I didn't translate the whole thing, but it's pretty much a point-by-point summary of the Mimer. And, this is what I do when I do this for myself. It helps me, review it and really get it very clear, get the flow very clear. You could maybe do it again, some of these steps in your head, but I find that it helps a lot to write it. And the Friedrich Rebbe used to do this, for a lot of my Marim too, like I mentioned. Okay. So let's go back through it and just get the points. So the first chapter of the Mimer. So we said on Hanukkah, we read about the sacrifices that the Nisim brought, because Hanukkah is when they rededicated the altar in the story of Hanukkah, which is similar to when it was originally dedicated by the Nisim. Therefore, the 8 days of Hanukkah are similar to the 8 days of the inauguration, but they're both divided to two groups: the first 7 days and then the 8th day. Which I just wrote in brackets here, that sometimes, it's helpful to kind of think about and translate a little bit into the theme. And if you think about the theme of the difference between the first 7 days and the 8th day in the story of the inauguration, so this summary, it's not necessarily exactly the same as the Kitzer that's at the end of each Mimer, because I'm doing a much more detailed summary here. This main point is more like a Kitzer, where it's just like a one-line thing. The Friedrich Rebbe actually would do that. He would write like a short summary and then at the end you would write a very, very short summary too. So, and I find that this is very helpful for me. But yeah, so I think if you think about it a little bit, the theme that Moshe, the first 7 days, was preparing and teaching the cut, Aaron and everything on how to do it, and it was like a deal of practice and preparation. And the 8th day represented independence, when okay, now it's the big day, it's your turn to actually do the real thing. So that's kind of what the difference between the 7 and 8 represent, that kind of practice and preparation, the training versus the actual independence of doing it. And similarly with Hanukkah, we have this idea of the first 7 and then the 8th day, although with Hanukkah we don't quite see that same difference seemingly, because they just seem to have the same miracle basically. But we see that the Rebbe is saying that the 8th day of Hanukkah has a special name, Zeis Hanukkah, and therefore in parentheses the Rebbe says we read more of the Torah on the 8th day of Hanukkah, which shows it's greater. And we said that the 8th day represents Malchus. That's what it says in Likutei Torah. So the main point is the similarity between the 8th day of Hanukkah and the 8th day of the inauguration. Okay. Then in Eis Beis, in the 2nd chapter of the Mimer, so the Rebbe then says that 8 has 2 implications, that it's higher than 7. Sorry that this was misspelled. Higher than the previous 7 and lower than higher than the 7 or lower than the 7. And so we said that 8 represents Bina, that's higher than the 7 midas, like the word Oz that it talks about in Kabbalah and Chassidus. That represents the idea of the Aleph that's higher than the 7, the Bina that's higher than 7 midas. And 8 also represents Malchus, which is lower than the 7 midas. And you have a little bit of a question why then you seem to be 6 midas, but that's a whole not necessarily get into that now. So too so we find this idea with the 8 inauguration days, that the 7 days it says represent the midas within Bina, and 8 that represents Chochmah, which is higher. And then there's another explanation that the 8th day is Malchus. So we see these 2 explanations of 8 being what's higher than the 7 or 8 being lower than the 7 when it comes to the inauguration. And so we have one of these, like a very central point here, that to draw something down into Malchus, it has to come from a higher source than the 7. And so now the Rebbe kind of has a question that seemingly the same should apply to Hanukkah, that the 8th day Malchus is Malchus because its source is higher, yet in the Mimer, in the Likutei Torah, it only says that it's Malchus. And the Rebbe says in one of the footnotes that the Tzemach Tzedek does say that when it comes to Hanukkah, the Tzemach Tzedek says that there is another pshat, that it's higher, but he says that's an opposite pshat. Unlike in the Mimer about the inauguration, where he brings both as complementary explanations. So even though there is this other explanation of the 8th day of Hanukkah, but that's viewed as being an opposite, opposing way of looking at the 8th day, as opposed to with the inauguration, where those are seen as being complementary. That's what the Rebbe talks about in the footnote there. But the simple thing is that in the Mimer Likutei Torah, he only brings this one explanation, unlike the Mimer on the inauguration, where he brings both. Why? And so the Rebbe says this implies that, and this is this is the main premise, the main point that we're gonna of the Mimer, is that this implies that the main theme of the 8th day of Hanukkah is only bringing down, and we don't need that idea, the complementary idea of in order to bring down, you have to come from the higher place. So the main point of this ice is the double theme of 8, that it can either be higher than 7 or lower than 7, yet in the Hanukkah Mimer, it only emphasizes the idea of going lower. Okay, the 3rd chapter. So we have the advantage of action, and we said that this equals Malchus within a person. Number 1, that action elevates the other faculties, and we give a mashal of a lever, that if you want to lift something up, you have to go from the bottom, otherwise you leave parts behind. We said that's like lifting a house. And you have to lift from the floor, or else you're going to leave the floor behind. And we also said that since it's a single unit, that even the walls are missing without the floor. So not just you're going to leave the floor behind, but you're going to not have fully functional walls and roof. And then we said in the nimshal of this is that the other faculties, that all the faculties when a person, the Seifa, Midas, and Maisa all influence each other. And so in order for the elevation of the higher faculties to be complete, we must elevate the lowest faculty. And then we gave a second idea. So we have one idea that action elevates the other faculties, and the other idea is that through action we actually lift the faculties higher than they could reach, not just that we have to lift from the bottom so that they don't drag it down, but they can actually bring them to a higher place. And we gave a mushal of a balanced scale for this, that when one arm dips down, the product goes down lower, then the higher arm, which is the weight, gets lifted higher. And in footnote 19, the Rebbe says we need both mishalim, because the scale emphasizes that the higher faculties need action for themselves, not just they won't be dragged down. And the lever emphasizes that even the elevation of the higher faculties is only complete through elevating the lower. So, it's and that's something maybe tzarchian to really understand the difference, but I'm not going to get so into it right now. Something later spend more time on. So the main point of this is that action elevates the higher faculties, and we said it's like a lever on a scale, and specifically because it's lower, it's able to elevate them higher. Okay, in section 4, so here we have our first shift, that action can perfect all the faculties because its source is actually higher than all of the faculties. And here we have two ideas in this. Number one, that expressing a faculty in action comes from the soul, the essence that's beyond the faculties. So in order to bring intellect or emotions down into action, it requires that the soul that's higher than intellect and emotions get plugged into the intellect and emotions and supercharge them. And so we said that intellect and emotions are limited and defined. They themselves can't descend into action. The ability to descend into action comes from the soul, which is in all the faculties equally. And this is, in parentheses, I wrote this idea of the sevev, which, like we mentioned in our template, this idea of the transcendence of the essence. One of the, the two kind of symptoms of the essence, or two ways it's expressed. One of them is this idea of sevev. And we'll see more of that later. Number two, we said that action itself is rooted higher than all the faculties. That other faculties are close to the soul, but action is separate, it's removed, because the other faculties come from revelation, just the expression of the soul, but action comes to the essence of the soul, which is essentially beyond revelation. So the main point of this chapter is that not only does action bring the soul into the other faculties, action is rooted higher in the soul, in the essence. Okay. Then chapter 5, just like in the soul, that action is rooted higher than other faculties, the same thing is true in Avodas Hashem. The greatest quality, perfection, or attainment is specifically through action, the physical mitzvahs, in other words. The superiority of study, the Talmud, and studying Torah versus doing mitzvahs is only now, but when in the times of Mashiach, action will be superior. And this proves that action is primary. And the reason the superiority of action will be appreciated specifically in times of Mashiach and not now requires we understand the two advantages of action. That action has two, that physical and those Maisa mitzvahs has two advantages over studied, similar to the two advantages of action within the soul. Number one, that the physical performance of the mitzvahs awakens and expresses the infinite light that's beyond Chachma. I'm going to capitalize that. That's beyond God's Chachma, the idea of Torah. And therefore, so in other words, if the mitzvahs reveal this infinite light of God that's higher than the Chachma that's revealed within Torah. And therefore, action brings godliness down lower. And number two, action reaches actually the essential concealment beyond even the infinite light. Brings the essence that's beyond sevev even. Okay, now, so now we're contrasting the time now in Gullus to the times of Gula, the times of Mashiach. So nowadays, the advantage of action, of Maisa mitzvahs, that study leads to action, is the first superiority that reveals this infinite light, and it brings perfection through revelation. And that's what we said that Maisa, that Talmud Gadol Shmei B'dei Maisa, that study spirit because it brings to action. So the advantage of action is part of the greatest of study, and the kind of study that leads to action is that's the full mature study. The true greatest type of study is when it's able to bring to action. And the revelation of the infinite in study is what allows it to descend and lead to action. So this is the way it is now. Nowadays, the advantage of action is expressed in bringing godliness into the Torah so that we can have proper understanding of Torah. But when Mashiach comes, the advantage of action will be in action itself. That we're going to reach this essential concealment of God's essence that's beyond revelation. So the main point of this is that now action is valued for improving study, improving our understanding of Torah, which is the revealing the infinite light. When Mashiach comes, we'll appreciate the advantage of action itself, which is its root in God's essence that transcends even the understanding of Torah or any sort of revelation. Then in 6, we said the Hanukkah. After the darkness of the Yevanim was a great revelation of godliness greater than the base of Mikdash before. The previous godly revelation could be overpowered by the darkness of the Yevanim, but Hanukkah was from the supreme, name of Hashem that's beyond creation, and this light can illuminate even darkness, like it says, Veh Hashem and Hashem, which represents a higher revelation of godliness, will brighten my darkness, that to the point where darkness itself will shine, similar to the times of Mashiach. And we said this is the difference between the 8th day of Hanukkah and the 8th day of the inauguration. That the 8th day of the inauguration, which is Malchus, the idea that it's Malchus, 8 lower than 7, indicates that the higher light is descending into Malchus, which is like that first type of superiority. But the 8th day of the Hanukkah is Malchus, the idea of the superiority that's elevated within Malchus itself, appreciating the true intrinsic value and source of Malchus itself. Therefore, the Mimer about the inauguration give these two explanations, because that's that first level. But the Mimer about Hanukkah only explains 8 is lower than 7 because it's this higher revelation of Mashiach. And the idea of a higher light being able to descend, which is like the 8th day of inauguration, is the superiority of the source of the light. That's like action now in times of Golos. That's 8 that's higher than 7. But the ability to refine and elevate the bottom itself, the 8th day of Hanukkah, is this essential concealment that's beyond revelation, beyond understanding, logic, and reason, like the times of Mashiach. Therefore, the Mimer emphasizes that the 8th of Hanukkah is refining the bottom. So the main point here is that the 8th day of the inauguration is action to revealing what's higher than light. The 8th day of Hanukkah is action where we're, in the sense that we're refining the bottom, revealing its source and essence. And then in the 7th, the final chapter, we say that the future advantage of action was revealed specifically in the later generations. It was revealed to us, even though now the halacha is still that study is superior, because the revelations of Mashiach depend on our actions now. And the superiority of action in the future comes from us working in and being meticulous in action now. Therefore, the generation right before Mashiach, it was revealed that action will be primary, that we will take it more seriously and achieve its fulfillment with Mashiach. Being that in the future action is superior, all matters of the redemption, especially redemption itself, need to happen in actuality. And as long as the actual redemption doesn't come, we're missing the main thing. And then it says the story that's Tzedek with the Marash about the Kates and the Kudei Torah, and we need to have the physical Gula, lower than 10 Tefachim, which is the idea, like I mentioned in Klipas Naiga. And then we said that Tzedek's answer is the idea that Hafatza brings Mashiach is because the Pimus of Torah is beyond time. So as soon as we spread Chassidus, we have Mashiach spiritually. But in things that exist within time, the cause has to come before the effect, and the effect only comes as a result of the cause. And this sort of relationship can be fast or slow. But in things that transcend time, there's no pause between the cause and effect. So there's a certain seeming superiority to the spiritual idea of Mashiach because you have it immediately as soon as you do it. And we find different tzaddikim, it talks about how they lived Mashiach now already. But, they had it spiritually, but we want it physically. But that's only true that the answer of the Tzemach Tzedek, this idea that we have it right away, is only in the way that Mashiach, Chassidus and Mashiach are beyond time. But the perfection of spreading Chassidus and Mashiach are when they come within time and space, within the actual 10 Tefachim. And in simple terms, our spreading Chassidus should actually bring Mashiach. And since Halacha requires us to eagerly await Mashiach, not just believe in it, and in the Halacha, the main thing is the simple sense and action. Therefore, we want Mashiach now in the simple physical sense. And so the main point is we need to emphasize action and actually spread Chassidus to bring Mashiach. Okay. So now that was step 2. And I do have to say that a big part of that, you gain a lot more doing it yourself than watching somebody else do it. So if you actually sit down and think about it and have to figure out the main point of each section and write it out, and then after you finish each chapter, think about, okay, what was the main point of that chapter? That exercise itself really helps you understand it very well. But, for now, I'll show you my work. Okay, step 3 is to find the 3-act structure. So first, what is the main theme of the Mimer? So thinking about it, I think, and then again, this is something you could think of it differently, and I'm sure there's many things you can get out of this Mimer. This is what I got out of the Mimer. It's just one way of unpacking it. I'm sure you can unpack it in different ways. So the theme that I felt was the main idea is the idea of how action versus the higher faculties of emotions, understanding, and even faith, even emunah. So we have our 3 views. The first worldly view that we came into the Mimer with is that we think that faith, understanding, and feelings are primary, and actions only serve to express these higher truths, to cultivate them or to cement them through habits and symbolism. And so, like for example, in the case of the Mishkan, we think of it that we have this idea of belief in the one God. An idea of making a Mishkan was to have a way to express that in simple physical action that simple physical people can relate to and things like that. But the main idea is the beliefs of and the understanding of the truth of the Torah, of the one God. So seemingly that's the primary thing. The paradigm shift is that action is not only essential to elevate the higher faculties, so it's not only going to help a person understand things better and have love and fear of God and deepen their faith. It also has its own value that reaches beyond the higher faculties. So actually doing a simple mitzvah or a simple custom has its own superiority that's higher than any of these things. And this superiority will be appreciated when Mashiach comes. Then the new harmony that's bringing this higher perspective back down is that it's true that now we must begin by focusing on study. Nevertheless, we must begin to emphasize action now, because Mashiach depends on our action. So even though it's true that now we live in the time of Golus where we need to first focus on learning, we're not ready to just do the actions and not need the study. We're still in that training period where it's very important that we learn first before we just run out and start doing things. But nevertheless, we need to now, since we're like about to graduate, basically, we need to start learning in a way that we're focusing the action, because Mashiach, again, depends on our actions, and therefore our study must be focused on spreading Chassidus outward in action. And like this idea that it's not just, we shouldn't just focus on learning and being displayed on ourselves, has to be focused on doing hafetza and influencing the outside of our lives and outside of our family and the other people, and has to be, so we do now still need to focus on learning, but it should be learning with an emphasis on action and relating to other people. Like we see the Rebbe encouraged us to focus on learning Chassidus with an effort of doing hafetza. So that's the basic, kind of Hisbonenus. And you could spend time going from here immediately to the second two types of Hisbonenus, to try and think of different examples of this theme in your life. And I'm sure you would get a lot of fruits just from doing that. But we're gonna dive a little deeper into the details. Okay, so step 4, we're going to now look to find the pairs of opposites. And so the first thing I usually do is I'll just try to go through the Mimer and just write down a list of all of the different opposites that I see, all the different pairs of like conflicting opposite things, and then I try to line them up and see how they fit. So we see this idea of Hanukkah versus the inauguration of the Mishkan. We find the idea of the first days of Hanukkah versus the 8th day of Hanukkah. In general, the idea of 7 versus 8. Then we talk about the idea of 8 as being something higher or 8 as being something lower. Those are two ways of looking at the idea of 8. So this is, let me just jump back to this template here. So like in the Mimer, Chassidus, for example, he explains how once you see the perspective of Chassidus, it elevates the other 4 levels, which are the Pshat Nefesh Side, or the Nefesh Ruach Neshama Chaya. And down here I have this little template of what they correspond to. So the Pshat, the Rebbe says, is human experience. Remez is the idea of things that relate to the outside world, more like global truths that are as opposed to just how we feel about things and experience things. Drush is the idea of Torah mitzvahs, or morality in general. Said is the of the spheres, godliness, and then the Chassidus is the essence. So I'm looking to find a bunch of pairs, and then I'm going to try to match them up to these 4. So that's what I'm but first I'm just looking to find anything that seems to be pairs that are in conflict, that are being contrasted in the Mimer. So there's the idea of action versus the higher faculties of, intellect and emotions and even emunah. We gave the 2 examples, a lever versus scale, those 2 mashalim. There's the idea of the physical mitzvahs, ma'isa versus studying Torah, Talmud, malchus versus the higher spheres, especially chachma, or, gave malchus versus bina or malchus versus chachma, galus versus gula, the giloi, the revelation, versus etzem, the essence, the Ein Sof, the infinite light, compared to the essence, which is kind of examples of this too. But I just put it down. We talked about action elevating study. In other words, appreciating action as something that's going to versus the superiority of action itself. We talked about the times of the Beis Hamikdash versus the darkness of the times of Hanukkah when there was the oppression of the Yevonim. And we talked about the spiritual Gula versus the practical Gula. And, some other things too. Maybe higher than time and lower and within time is maybe another pair that you could add on to there. And I'm sure you could find more than these two. Okay, so that's what I did. And then I go and I try to match them up. And usually, the first thing I'm really trying to do is just find the basic 4. And usually those are found in the beginning. Because later, when it talks about some of the other pairs, are usually connecting to how we elevate these 4. And so right away in the beginning, really in the first, usually in the first, the Rebbe's maamar are very organized. I find that the Rebbe really kind of follows this template. And so in the first chapter, the Rebbe lays out these 4. And so this is the way I lined it up. Maybe it's not the right way, but this is the way I understood it. So at the pshat level, the level of human experience, we have this idea of Hanukkah, which is the idea of rededication after oppression, fighting the darkness, trying to rekindle our faith, having this grassroots kind of movement where the Maccabees and the Hashmonayim were trying to fight back against assimilation, versus the inauguration of the Mishkan, where Moshe was given this prophetic vision from Hashem, and he was told they're just enacting it. It was all done in a much more positive way. You did have the Cheder Egel, the sin of the golden calf there, but in general, it was just this mitzvah they were given, and making their faith tangible and relatable. It was done in a much more positive thing. And in general, the time the Beis Hamikdash was, when it wasn't being rebuilt after being destroyed, it was a different type of thing. So it was being done the first time, as opposed to being fixed after being messed up. So that's kind of the experience of it. And sometimes you have to think a little bit. If you just take Hanukkah versus the inauguration of the Mishkan originally, you kind of miss the human experience of it. So I think you have to think about, well, what was the difference in the experience of Hanukkah versus the inauguration? And the difference in experience is that difference of whether you're overcoming oppression and darkness, or whether you're just were taught how to do something and you're enacting it. It's like the difference between when you were trained and taught what to do and now it's your big day to go do it, or if you messed up and you have to go fix something. So it's a different type of experience. Then on the level of remez, which again is like Yetzirah, it's like the outside world, that seems to be the idea of action versus the higher faculties of understanding, emotions, and faith. Then the level of drush, bria, which is the realm of Torah mitzvahs, it's the idea of the practice of the mitzvahs, Maisa, versus the study of the Torah Talmud. And the level of Side, which is Atzilus and the Spheros, that's the idea of Malchus versus the higher Spheros, specifically Chachma. Okay, so now that we have our 4, we figured out what are the 4 that we're going to apply this theme to. Now we're going to try to plug in the paradigm shift that we saw in step 3 and see how the Mimer is changing our perspective of each of these 4. That we came in with a worldly view in each of these, and it's changing each of those. So let's take a look at that. Yeah, so the reason that I put it here as the lower pair and the higher pair is because usually when we come into the Mimer from like our worldly perspective, we tend to view one of the two things that are in opposition as being the superior option. And so usually a Mimer can say we have this opposition between these two things. We tend to look at it that this is better or higher and this one is lower, and then Chassidus shows us how we can actually flip it and see how the other one is higher. And then we come back to the original perspective where we see the original one that was higher is higher, the other one is lower, which is the worldly perspective, but we bring something of that higher perspective back. So that's why I did that. But you don't necessarily have to think of them as higher and lower, but that's the way I usually think of it that way. That there's one that we tend to think of as being higher or being superior, and then later we make a shift. So, okay, so now in step 6, I went back through the Mimer, or really just like the main point of each Mimer, and tried to find where were the main shifts. And so chapters 1 and 2, the end of chapter 2 kind of hints at the first shift. And then also chapter 3 still are kind of taking our first assumption. I think really chapter 4 is where he gives us the big shift of saying actually Malchus is a higher source, because in the first 3 chapters we're assuming the main thing is the higher faculties of intellect, emotions, and faith, and we're saying okay, but action has something to contribute. There's a little bit of a little bit of a shift there, a little bit of a hint that action can give us something and we need it and has a certain advantage, but the whole point of that advantage is still to serve the seichel and midas. So you could put the shift kind of at 3, but I think the main shift is really in the beginning of chapter 4, where he says that the reason that it can do that is because action source is higher. So it's you could put it either way, but the idea that seeing that action has a superiority over the higher faculties, that's the first shift. Then in chapter 5 we apply this first shift to Torah. In chapter 6 we apply it to Hanukkah, and we find the unity, see how this, and also to the the spheres, and we see how it unites all of those. The theme unites them all, and they're all really interconnected. And then the new harmony which is the second shift, happens in the last chapter, where the Rebbe says, but nowadays we're still in Golos, and so how does that, how do we bring this higher perspective back down, and what does that mean for us now? It's nice to know that that's the way it is in theory, that's the way it's going to be, but what does it mean for us nowadays? So let's take a look at how we do this. So now I'm going to go to step 7. I'm going to take this first shift, where I'm going to try to see how the Rebbe applied that first shift to each of these levels, and really make sure I see the way I looked at that level before the Mimer and how I'm looking at it now with this new paradigm shift in the Mimer. So, which is this kind of idea of an elevating view. It's the idea of taking something from like yichud tata to yichud ilah in terms of the world, to be going from the asiya of the general worlds to asiya de klolos. So instead of looking at it from a perspective of like the lower unity, where the world of the physical world of asiya, would be looking at it from a perspective where tzilos would be asiya, and so that's in terms of spheros and things like that. Okay, so the first thing was we started off seeing Hanukkah as being, we're comparing it to the original inauguration of the temple, and we say, okay, there's a certain parallel there because we're rededicating it, but in general, Hanukkah seems to be inferior in many ways, because first of all, it was a time of exile, it was a time of oppression, they didn't have, all the special carbonates and all the miracles that happened. There was the miracle of the oil, but it wasn't the same thing as before. So it seems like that Hanukkah is just like a little taste of that original glory, but it's not as good at it as the original one. Then the paradigm shift, we end up saying that actually specifically because Hanukkah was a time of darkness, it was able to accomplish a greater revelation of godliness than the original temple, because the original temple we see that its light was able to be extinguished, but what was accomplished through Hanukkah was able to overcome that darkness. So it obviously was a greater light. So actually, it's shifting our perspective and seeing, and it's not just Hanukkah, the inauguration. It's the idea that in Golos we can accomplish something greater than we can in the times when things are all just good and easy. And we'll think more about some of the implications or applications of this afterwards. But so that's the first, seeing that first shift. Then in the level of remez, yitzir in the world, so we start off seeing action as being inferior to the higher faculties, but it's maybe necessary to elevate and perfect the higher faculties. In other words, so really I'm interested in, and a person that has a certain, it's like a spiritual immaturity, where really I just want to learn Torah and be inspired, and then you have to kind of get bribed and told, well, to really understand Torah properly, you're going to have to go out and do mitzvahs and give tzedakah and have Avos Yisrael, and that's going to, refine your mind and heart 1,000-fold. It's like, here, I'm going to give you a candy. If you don't appreciate the real value, it's like a burden, something that you have to do. But, okay, you'll get benefit from it. It's like in general, practice. People don't like to practice. They want to just be able to do it. And the same thing, people want to, let's say, just be a professor. They don't want to have to deal with experiments and that kind of practical thing. They like to think about theories, stuff like that. But then the paradigm shift is that action actually has its own value and source that's beyond the higher faculties in essence. So not only can it elevate the other ones, but there's actually intrinsic value in the action, not just because, so in other words, we don't just need action to express our feelings and our understanding and our faith. or to even help support our understanding and faith, or to elevate it to a higher level. There's something superior that's intrinsically valuable about the action itself. That's something that's more essential and higher than what you can accomplish through any amount of understanding or any amount of feelings. Certain things you gotta just do it. You have to experience it. And there's something of value in experiences that's higher. Okay, then the level of drush, bria, Torah, mitzvahs. So we start off, with this idea that Talmud, the Talmud Gadol, Talmud is primary, studying Torah is the main thing because it leads to action, and that action elevates Torah study by revealing the infinite within study. So there's an idea that when you learn Torah in a way that's halacha l'maisa, you're going to understand the Torah better. But the paradigm shift is that action actually, the physical mitzvahs are actually primary and they're superior. There's an advantage of doing the actual mitzvah, and that will be revealed when Mashiach comes. And the idea is that action is, like we said, is to reveal God's essence that's beyond understanding. So what we can accomplish and not appreciate in godliness in Torah, there's something even higher than that we can accomplish through doing a physical mitzvah, and we're going to really only appreciate that when Mashiach comes. And then in the level of sight, which is Atzilos, the idea of spheres. So we started off with this perspective that Malchus is lower than the other spheres. It's especially lower than Chachma. And in general, like it says, that Malchus has nothing of its own. It only serves to receive and express the higher spheres. Or the idea that Malchus represents how godliness comes into time and space and things like that. Although in the worldly view, we don't really know what those words mean. They're just words. But then with the paradigm shifts, we have this idea that Malchus has its own root and source. Also, we understand what Malchus is, that Malchus is how godliness comes into time and space. And it's rooted in God's essence, which is beyond the root of Chachma, which is the infinite light. And so I should actually put that here, because that's kind of important. God in time and space. And that's beyond the root of Chachma, which is the infinite light. So that there's an idea that the way that God is revealed in Malchus is actually higher than even the infinite light that are in before the Tzimtzum. Okay, so now that we see this paradigm shift in these four, we can see a unity between these four. Because initially, when we first learned the first ice of the Mimer, there doesn't seem to be that much of a connection between Hanukkah and the inauguration of the temple and this idea of 8 and action and Malchus, and all these things just seem like very disconnected ideas that are just loosely related, symbolically related to each other. But and I didn't spell this out too much because I think it's something that after going through this process, becomes pretty clear how all four pairs really express this theme of how what is lower not only elevates what's above it, but it has its own intrinsic value rooted in the essence beyond what is higher. And so really the idea of Hanukkah and the idea of action and the idea of Maisa, the physical mitzvahs, and the idea of Malchus all clearly share this same essential theme, that when you look at them from the perspective of the essence, they have this intrinsic value, and they're not, and the basic idea is that we shouldn't, the worldly view is that we tend to value things until we have a certain value system that creates a certain hierarchy, and we assign things value based on that system, but they don't really have their own intrinsic value. But when you reveal the essence, you see, no, that each thing has its own intrinsic value. And actually, when viewed from a certain perspective, something that may seem lower actually has a superiority and an intrinsic value that's higher than those other things that you usually think of as being higher and giving it value. And then, okay, so now it's time to come back down. So we did our yichud, we did our upper unity. Okay, so somebody asked a question based on that Hayom Yom that I mentioned earlier about the 3 types of Hisbonenus, the one of learning, and which you do before davening, when you learn. Then there's the second one where you find the chayas, which happens before davening, and then there's find the godliness, which is during davening. So far, these 10 steps we're almost done with the 10 steps. These are all part of what I consider the learning stage. So we're almost done, like learning the Mimer, really understanding it, really seeing all the shifts. And once we have this really clear, we're going to have material that we can use to really then sit down. And it doesn't, a good time is before davening, but it doesn't have to be before davening. But it should be a separate step of now sitting down and just thinking about how do I see this in my life. So we're going to do that soon. But yeah, these 10 steps we're still finishing up, really just understanding the Mimer and getting it clear. Okay, so now we're going to apply the second shift, which is the idea of coming back down. So I just copied here in this, with the template I used for the first ones, but I added on another level below it, which is how we bring this higher perspective back down into our more worldly perspective, where we keep something at a higher perspective. So coming back down, this is like there's the Ratzai and the Shuv, going yichud law back down to yichud tata, and that's the way you make a complete yichud proper Hisbonenus. So I'm doing it in the order, when coming back down, it usually doesn't go necessarily in the same order. So I'm going to do it in the order that's in the Mimer, more or less. Okay, so today, the first thing is level Bria and Torah mitzvahs, the idea of whether Talmud is gadol, Torah, which is more superior, studying Torah or doing mitzvahs. So we said that we generally think that Talmud is gadol, but when Mashiach comes, it's going to be revealed how Ma'aseh gadol, how the physical mitzvahs are superior. But now coming back down, okay, that's very nice. That to say that one day we're going to appreciate how action is greater, but today the halacha and the reality that we experience is that Talmud is gadol, that the main thing is to study Torah. But even though that's true, as we approach Mashiach, it was revealed that action will be primary, and so now we have this awareness that we're within the realm of studying. In other words, we're like studying about Mashiach, we're studying about what will be, because now we are within our study, we already have to start studying with the focus on action and increase our focus on action. So it's true that we're still in a realm where we need to perfect our understanding of Chassidus before we'll be ready to go out there. Just like, before somebody goes out, you have to have training so you know what you're doing. You can't just go out and be a brain surgeon unless you have enough study behind it. And once, like in any field, once a person has enough study, then they get the experience becomes greater than anything they learn in a book, anything they learn from their teacher, and they don't need to have the study in the same way. The main thing for them is the actual experience that they gain through doing it. But you need to have a certain amount of study first to gain that value from the experience. So now we're still in that stage where we're in the study phase, but we're like kind of like a doctor that's finished medical school and now he's in residency or something. We're in this stage where we're getting ready to graduate, and our study has to be focused on action, and we have to start actually applying it, and that's very important to start getting that connection from the study to the action. So that's kind of bringing that higher perspective of what will be back down to where we are now in terms of Torah and mitzvahs. Then when it comes to Remez, idea of Yetzirah and the world, so again, the worldly view was that action is inferior. Then we had this paradigm shift of how action has its own value, that's not just in terms of being able to elevate intellect and emotions, but it's actually its sources and essence, and there's this intrinsic value in just the experiences. And bringing that back down, that the future superiority of action depends on us now. So we need to focus our study on action, which will allow us to elevate action itself. So again, and then on the level of side within the spheres, so we talked about this idea of how Malchus is lower than the Chachma, or Malchus has its own source and essence that's higher than the root of Chachma. And then bringing that back down in the levels beyond time, Chachma, there's a certain superiority that we can have Geula now as soon as we spread Chassidus, yet we need to reveal that, we need to reveal it within Malchus, within time and space, which is the main thing. But it's a process. So we appreciate there is a certain advantage to that higher idea of the spiritual Geula, but the main thing is we have to be bringing it down into Malchus, and we have to also understand that within Malchus it's a process and it can take time, unfortunately, to actualize it. And so, in a certain, we can have it spiritually now, but we may take time to make that actually happen physically. And then the level of Pshat, which is a sicha and human experience, we start off thinking that Hanukkah is inferior to the inauguration of the temple, and then we appreciated how Hanukkah, specifically because it was a time of darkness and oppression and Gullus, was able to accomplish something greater, bring a greater godly light that couldn't be extinguished. And And one second. And then the way we bring that back down, we see the Gula depends on our actions now in Gullus because of the superiority of Gullus. So there is a certain superiority now, like Hanukkah, and therefore specifically our actions that can now, which is going to be able to bring Mashiach by us spreading, doing a Fatzos Meros now, that's going to make it a reality. Somebody asked whether this paradigm shift is more an experiential process than intellectual. So again, you need to learn about the paradigm shift in order to really help make it happen. But then you're only going to fully understand it when you apply it to your life and experience it. That's the only way to really understand it. Like I compare it to if I have a kid that's afraid of the water, you could talk to them till you're blue in the face. You're not going to change how they feel about it. You could, but if you teach them, about how to swim and teach them technique, and then you bring them to a very, a pool or shallow water and get them to slowly put their face in the water and blow bubbles and start doing these things and get those experiences, the fact that you explained to them what to do and then they did it and they saw that it worked and they, they're able to then get the confidence to do more and more and eventually change how they actually feel and really change how they relate to it. So in a similar thing, we can't truly change our understanding of perspective unless we have the experience, but the experience has to be driven by that understanding. We have to say, okay, here's the model, here's the theory, and then when you go apply it, you see that it works, it really gives you the deeper understanding, which then will eventually give you the independence. And that's the idea of, the main idea of this Mimer is that relationship, that you need the understanding, and then at first you need the experience and the practice to help really get the true understanding. And then eventually when you have a true enough understanding, you'll be able to then become independent and not need to be consciously like following the instructions. You'll be able to get enough experience to just, do it. And then the action will become the main thing. So that's the idea. Okay, so the final step here in this learning process, step 10, seeing the essence mainly in the outside. And this is the idea that the essence of Mashiach is specifically when we transform the darkness, like the idea of the 10 Tvachim of Klippa, and therefore we need to bring it into the physical reality in order to, because again, the main, as long as all of these ideas remain truths, they're only the truths that we can only appreciate within the realm of holiness, within a sefer, within, our kind of sheltered system, then we still have a certain doubt and still the possibility that it can be extinguished by darkness. But when we've brought it out and tested it and see that it's able to overcome those, fears and doubts, that's when it really becomes real and really gain that kind of true independence. And in this sense, the idea of having that independence means that our connection to godliness and our faith is able to be something that we really truly know, not just because we were told it and because it says in the book, but because we see that we see it in ourselves and we see it in the world. And that comes from, actually bringing it out into the world of darkness where we have challenges to it and still we see that it's a real thing. So that's the basic idea of learning the Mimer. And, so this is a process, but it's not, it takes some time to do, definitely. Also, the 10th step is just recognizing how the real essence is only when you bring it specifically outside. That this essence is that we talked about here, which is this idea that the superiority of action is only really triggered and fully actualized when you bring it to the outside, like in the case where you bring it to a case where it's, to some situation where it's darkness or there's opposition. That's what's necessary in order to fully trigger the revelation of that. So in general, the 10th step is the idea of seeing how the essence, which is the idea of whether it's God essence or the essence of Hasidus or the essence of our yichud, of our soul, is only revealed. It's only fully revealed when, in order to transform some sort of darkness, that's the lowest thing, that's the most outside. And that's why we need to do a Fatzos Meros. Hasidus has to be brought outside in order to bring Mashiach and things like that, because you only fully reveal the essence when it's brought to the place of darkness and transforms the darkness. And so that's an important part of the theme you're going to have, in any of these maamar or sichas and things like that. And again, we saw it here. That's why specifically in the time of darkness of Hanukkah, and particularly specifically in Gullus, when we have the darkness and oppression, that's what gives us the ability. We think of that as a disadvantage, but that's actually what allows us to reveal that essence, which is what's going to then bring Mashiach and bring all these things. Okay, so, and again, there's a lot to review and think about just in understanding the Mimer, and you could go look in some of the sources in the background that will give more richness and appreciation to some of the subtleties that are just hinted at. There's a lot there in any Mimer of the Rebbe. But for now, let's just go on. I wanted to show you, the idea of, what I do from this. So after finishing something like this, and having this, basic understanding. So then, I try to think of what are different ways that I can see this paradigm applied in my life. So somebody asked about, I mentioned that the Rebbe's Mimarim seem to fit in this template very well, usually in order. And what about the other Rebbeim? So the other Rebbeim's Mimarim, I think they also have it here, but it's not always, I don't think it's always as easy to see the order. Sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. For example, I think the Rebbe's, for example, like the Rebbe's Chasana Mimer versus the Friedrich Rebbe's Chasana Mimer, I think the Rebbe changes the order around a little bit to make that more clear. But I usually do this with the Rebbe's Maamar and Sichas because I find it easier to do this complete thing with it. But I've done a little bit of a similar thing with some other Sfarim, and you definitely can do it. But it might, might take a little more work. Okay, so now, as far as the Hisbonenus in life, so this is the real richness. I think when you start getting, appreciating the treasures that you found, is when you think about, okay, how do I see examples of this paradigm shift in all different areas of life? And there are so many of them. I just wrote a few general things as like kind of like springboards to start thinking about it. But like I would spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to find examples of this in more specific things too, not just these general things. But these are good directions to start thinking about it. And I'm sure all of you can find many, many, many specific examples of this. So let's take a look at some of them. So let's say in Hanukkah. So in Hanukkah, the idea that I think, like, again, the theme is really about independence. And so Moshe was trying to prepare everybody, for the Mishkan to become independent. And so he trained them for 7 days. He said, okay, now you go do it, and you can, bring the kabbalas and things like that. But independence isn't just about mastering what you were taught, which would be like the 8th day of the inauguration when Moshe turned everything over, where we were taught what to do, and then we started following those instructions properly on our own. But the real essence of independence is when you discover who you really are. So it's not just that you're able to successfully do what you were taught to do, but you were able to realize that there's something that your teacher is really, sees something inside of you, and you discover that thing inside of you that is like it talks about how the deepest idea of let's say going to visit a tzaddik's caver is that you find a bit of the tzaddik within yourself. And that's the idea that we all have that little bit of Moshe within us, that little bit of that godly essence in us, and that's what Hanukkah was about. It was revealing that we found, we lost, the in general, the Jewish people felt they couldn't stand up to the Greek philosophy, and their faith was getting very weak, and people were becoming very, secular, very influenced, very assimilated, and all of the everything they were taught didn't seem to be enough to stand up to that, just doing what they were told to do. But then they found within themselves, what, I'm a Jew, and this is what I am, and this is who we are, and they weren't gonna just let go of that. And so they had this self-sacrifice, and they brought this deeper place. They found it within themselves, and were able to rekindle that in a lot of other people to realize that even I'm not just doing it because I was told to do it and because I understand it, and therefore, if somebody comes and debates with me, I could be dissuaded or be confused, saying, well, whether I understand it or not, this is who I am, and I feel it in my bones, and this is who, part of who I am. And so they're finding it in that deeper way. That's the real idea of independence, and this is a very important thing for us. The Rebbe very often, talks about this idea, this theme that he wants us to find the idea in ourselves, not just do it because he told us to do it, but we should really find it in ourselves. And it's a very important thing in Chinuch, that it's not just about teaching our children or whatever, our students, to follow what they're told or repeat what they were taught, but they should really find ideas in themselves and really, discover something about themselves and give them the opportunity to do that, which sometimes requires giving them a chance to make a choice and even have the opportunity for darkness where they can make a wrong choice and make a mistake, but there's something you learn from that. So it's a very deep and important idea. It relates to the idea of Jewish identity, that we have feelings, we have understanding, we have even faith, but all those things can be extinguished. And this is, by the way, the idea in Shari'ira, which is one of the sources for this Mimer. That's how it starts off, talking about how all of these spiritual qualities can all have opposition from Klippa and can be extinguished. But when it comes to simple things, like just simple actions and like simple stories, like the idea of the Hanukkah and the whole thing of the miracle of Hanukkah was, it's like a story. But those simple things can rekindle these feelings and understanding in the faith. And a lot of times the simple actions, stories reveal our inner core and our inner identity, which becomes expressed in this Mesiras Nefesh self-sacrifice, which is much more powerful than the faith or reason. So it's able to help us. A lot of times the simple thing of having a latke on Hanukkah can be, and like we see, the Rebbe talks about how simple minhagim are actually, which a person would tend to think aren't important, in many ways are actually more important than all of the other things and even all the reasons and all this kind of stuff. And you see, that's what really sticks with people, sitting and lighting a candle. It's not, it's not a mitzvah in the Torah to light the Hanukkah candles, and it was something enacted by the Chachamim, and it became, but it's such a simple action, but you see that has such a powerful effect on people and having a real sense of identity, and they go out in the streets and they see a menorah, and it, awaken something in them, especially in this time of day, time of year when there's all these other symbols of other religions, and a Jew can go out and see that. There's a tremendous power that's beyond anything that we could explain or understand in these simple things. So we definitely shouldn't, overlook the value and importance of those kind of things. And the Rebbe also talked about the importance of telling stories of miracles in relation to Hanukkah. The Rebbe emphasized that because there's a power in saying stories. And it's actually something that the Rebbe had a little bit of a debate about with the previous Rebbe, that that used to be in Chabad, they wouldn't tell miracle stories. And the Rebbe argued that it's important to do that, and you see the Rebbe encouraged it and did do that a lot more. So somebody asked if I said earlier that Afatzas Mayanos Chutza is Tikkun Hamidas. So there's the idea of Hafatz Mayanas Chutza within oneself, which is taking the understanding and having it be brought out to one's own Nefesh Bahamis and one's own Yetzer Hara. So that's the first step of Hafatz Mayanas. Then there's being able to bring it out into your surroundings, to your family, and then eventually to the world, the real, outside world. So there's different aspects of Hafatz Mayanas Chutza. And then again, in Avaida, we have this idea that in Avodas Hashem, action is the main thing. And not only, like the Rebbe always says, does it elevate our mind and hearts 1,000-fold, but also it has its own intrinsic value that's beyond something that you can explain or not just because it's going to benefit something else. And so that's something to appreciate, the intrinsic value of just doing things. And a lot of times, if you want to make a change, you see, like the Rebbe would just tell people, to do these very simple things. If you look at the Rebbe's letters and the Rebbe's dollar, the Rebbe is always encouraging people, just give a little bit of tzedakah, 3 pennies before, every day before you daven, or, do chitas or whatever, these very simple things, but those changes a lot of times have a much more profound impact than anything else. So again, it's something to, appreciate in relationships. So again, we a lot of times think of action as just something that's expressing how we feel to another person, or maybe cultivating those feelings. Like it says that, that a person's feelings are affected by what they do. But it's not only that, but that actions also matter more in a lot of ways than the feelings. So, there's the idea that there's these 3 ways you can view it. You can view it, well, I'm just going to do something if I feel like doing it. You can say, no, I'm going to purposely do things in order to bring feelings of love and affection to somebody and cultivate a relationship. There's also the idea that, doing certain actions and helping somebody matters more than how we feel. And you see that very much, let's say, with like a parent and a child or something like that, the fact that you get up in the middle of the night and, whether it's change a diaper or clean up, throw up, or take care of them, or these kind of things, like that's obviously not something that you feel like doing, but, you feel the sense of responsibility, and the fact that you do those actions is much more important than, the feelings of love and stuff like that, in a sense. Like that's what's actually taking care of the person and providing what they need, in a very real sense. So sometimes, obviously, you need both, but um, and that's, again, there's a complicated relationship between the two, that if you don't have the right feelings and you don't think about things in the right way, then you're not going to do the actions. But in another sense, the actions will help you have those feelings, and even deeper, the actions are what's really going to give you the result. You have this in science. It's a very important thing that, on the one hand, experiments, help us prove and refine our models and our theories. But on a deeper level, all of our mental models that we create are not, true representations of reality. And this is something that's now, well understood in mathematics, has been proven, and in science, the idea that you can never really create a theory that's going to completely describe reality, that's going to be accurate. It's just a little model that can help. And the real essence of the real purpose of the model is just to help you figure out, what actions are the correct actions to take. And so the main thing is the physical action, the physical reality. But again, you wouldn't be able to recognize those sometimes without those mental models, but you need to have that humility about it. In godliness, there's the idea of being able to appreciate the beauty and the wonder in everything, which is the idea of appreciating the advantage of Malchus itself, not just appreciating the physical world as an expression of, let's say, these higher laws and principles, or, the expression of God's ability to do anything, create things. The idea is that God didn't just create the world to show that he could do whatever he wants. And then in that perspective, then the example isn't really important. But actually, there's a deeper perspective, which is really the opposite, that really God wanted to create this physical world. And all the spheroids are created, that whole idea of all those abilities and infinite light are all created in order to facilitate the world. And that's something that's emphasized a lot in Hasidus. And so these simple things, if you can appreciate, let's say, the beauty, like a butterfly's wing, or, anything in the world around you, this is what God actually chose to create. And all the higher philosophical deep things are, in a way, less important than just the appreciating the actual world around us. If you can appreciate it not just, as a window into something higher, but appreciate that this is actually God himself right here and right now. And so it gives us a much more appreciation of the here and now, as opposed to, kind of wanting to leave the world and having this, sense of Ratzon. In terms of the Gula, also, we have this idea, we have to appreciate that we can have the Gula now, because Gula is something that's beyond time and space. And so I think this is very important to understand a lot of the Rebbe's messages, that really we have Mashiach, we have the Hasidus, we have the Hisbonenus, we have it essentially. And, it's right here, and it's a real thing in this deeper sense. Yet the main thing is to bring that deeper thing into the world around us. But if we don't have it in that deeper way, if we don't understand Hasidus and understand what Mashiach is in this deeper way, we're not going to be able to make it happen in the world around us either. So we need to have that spiritual understanding of the Gula in order to actualize it, although the main thing is not just have the spiritual Gula, the main thing is have the physical Gula. So again, there's a lot to investigate and apply this to all the different sichas and maamar and things about Mashiach and the Gula, but this is a very fundamental relationship. An example of that is like with the temple service, that seemingly, and this is a question that, that I used to think about a lot, and Alter Rebbe talks about it in Mimer, that seemingly when Mashiach comes, if we're all going to be enlightened people, why would we want to have pagan-style temple services? Why do we want to rebuild the base of Mikdash and have karbanos? It seems like, then they needed it because that's the way the world was. When Mashiach comes, everybody be enlightened. Why would you want those kind of simple physical things, those simple rituals? Yet there's, a certain power and value in these kind of simple rituals and customs and traditions, and they reach the core of our being, and they're a certain, eternal treasure. And whatever explanation that I could give of why they're important fails to capture it, because that's the whole point, is that there's something that's special about certain things like that reaches deeper into who we are and what we are, that's beyond what we could explain or describe. And like you see, if people feel very connected when, they do something that's connected to their heritage, something for thousands of years, whatever it is, you can't explain it, but that's, we see it. And, on a personal level, when I'm in a rut, in something and I'm struggling with something. So if I learn Chassidus, something like this Mimer, and I think about its lessons, so it can help and inspire me to take certain actions. And sometimes it's inspiring me to take the actions, even if I don't feel like doing it or understand it, but I know that at least the Mimer and the Chassidus gives me enough awareness to push myself to say, okay, but just do it anyway. And then those actions are really what's able to pull me out of the rut. So if I wouldn't have learned the Mimer, I wouldn't have taken action. But the act is really what's going to then make that change happen. And then after doing the action for a while, then you regain the awareness and the perspective to appreciate it and feel it. And there's so many examples of this, whether it's going to Minyan, whether the Rebbe talks about dancing on Simchas Torah. If you don't feel like it, just start dancing, and then you'll feel the Simcha. Or whether it's chitas or rambam or any of these kind of things. Once, sometimes you fall into a rut and you don't feel like doing it, but once you just start, and after doing it for a while, then you start to feel it too. And so we see this again, very often the Rebbe's messages are very, very simple actions and inspiring people, with whatever perspectives and things. But the point of the perspective is the Maiso Iker. And we see the great perspective that happens. So there's a lot of areas in life where these and a lot of other ones that you could see the application of this. A lot of applications in, again, in chinuch, in our own personal avoda. And then the final thing is, in the Hisbonenus, that being able to appreciate the godliness of it. And after seeing these different examples in life around us and maybe experiencing some of these changes. So then I think we can start to appreciate a deeper thing. And the main thing is that instead of judging things by an external value system, we can start to see the intrinsic value of it. And that's where we start seeing the godliness, the essential godly value in a thing, which means appreciating each person, not just for what he can become, but for what he is. Like there's a sicha that talks about this idea, comparing Moshe to Chanayich, and Avraham, that Chanayich, and Avraham tried to influence people, like just because if they would eventually be able to become a tzaddik. But Moshe appreciated that people have this intrinsic value, and therefore he had Mesiras Nefesh to help people after the Chedei Egel, even the Erev Rav, and things like that, because you appreciate that if the value of a person isn't because they're going to do this or that, or because they're a tzaddik, but just the person has an intrinsic godly value, they're chelik like mamish, and therefore whatever you can do to help the person physically and spiritually has intrinsic value, and it's worth having Mesiras Nefesh for. So that's, a godly perspective looking at a person. You have this godly perspective, appreciate each mitzvah, and again, this idea that there's that if you're mitzvah, patrim mitzvah, when you're doing a mitzvah, you shouldn't pass over one mitzvah, so you don't pass over one opportunity for another one. And if you're doing one mitzvah, you're pat from other mitzvahs, because you have to appreciate there's intrinsic value in each thing. And the value of that mitzvah is not based on any sort of calculation or value system that you could come up with of what you're accomplishing. It's something much deeper that's beyond anything, and therefore you should appreciate that essential godly value in a mitzvah, and then you'll do it with this deeper hiddur and beauty and appreciation and enjoyment. Same thing, appreciate every creation as seeing it as just a godly expression, like we talked about, just a plant, an animal, whatever it is, and talks about Baal Shem Tov, would appreciate that, and we should appreciate that in life and things. And the same thing with every moment in life. We should appreciate that it's it's a godly moment. God created, He chose to create us and the world with this exact scenario, this moment, and and there's some good and some godly purpose to be learned and to be accomplished here, even if it's a dark moment, if it's a time of like in Gullus and things like that. So we should be able to have that appreciation, even and that doesn't mean that we're enjoying it. Doesn't mean that we have that higher perspective where it's not hard. It is hard, and it is Gullus, and we don't want it, and it is painful. But at the same time, we realize that there's the possibility to learn and grow and to appreciate something there too. And so it gives us a certain eye of the storm to be able to help us make through it. Somebody asked which sicha, but I'm not sure what you mean. Maybe if you have a little more details, I can try to point you to the sicha that I mentioned. And then, also, again, this is the general idea of seeing these godly sparks. When we see these godly sparks in other people and in the world around us, so then it inspires us to be a godly force of doing good and helping to reveal it and kindle those sparks and bring them out by relating to that essence in each person. Like the Rebbe, as a godly person, he saw that spark in each person and that unlimited value, and everything was directed towards how can I help the person bring it out. And we can be find something of that in ourselves, where we can be a godly force in the world and in the, to the people around us. Yeah, so I mean, I think corresponding to that, somebody's asking, are these last two sections done before or during davening? So I think that what it's talking about in the Mimer is that this Hisbonenus of life, this second thing, is done before davening, and then during davening would be this Hisbonenus of godliness. But again, there's also the idea, like it talks about, that sometimes you can daven before you daven. So if you do this, you learn the Mimer, and then you do this whole process. I think that doing this third process here of thinking about the godliness, that itself really is the definition of davening, even if you're not doing it with the words of the siddur. So the whole point of the words of the siddur, though, is meant to be appreciating these things that are in this third stage. But to really appreciate that requires sometimes the preparation of learning something and with this kind of perspective to help us gain this perspective. Yeah. So this idea of bringing out the enjoyment in Yiddishkeit and is very much connected to Hasidus and the Baal Shem Tov and things like that. So hopefully this was insightful, and hopefully you can appreciate how, after putting in this work, that the Mimer isn't just like a nice little vart about Hanukkah, but it's a real springboard for a life-changing type of Hisbonenus. You could spend years and years thinking about this and finding different applications of it and working on applying it to your life in different areas. And it's an amazing, tremendous thing. And I think the more deeply you delve into something like this, you start seeing how it's connected to every other Mimer and every other sicha. And you start seeing how they're all really the same theme being applied in different areas and different spaces. And you start seeing that interconnectedness more and more. And I really hope that some of you would, or maybe all of you, we could try this out for yourself. And maybe in the future we could try it out together with a sicha or something like that. But I'd love to see, if some of you could try it out and see if, how it is. You go through the process, and if you get stuck, maybe we could choose a sicha or something to work on together and give you a chance to try to work on it, and then, work on it together, and then hopefully get to a point where this is something that everybody could do, if you think it's valuable. Yeah, so you're very welcome. And yeah, I hope you found it very helpful. And if somebody raise their hand, if you want to say something, you're welcome to. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So for now, I guess we'll stop here, and we'll see if in the future we're gonna maybe pick a sicha. We could try going through it together in the future at some point. Okay. Everyone, Freilich and Hanukkah. Hopefully this will give a little extra inspiration to the Hanukkah, especially coming to Zeis Hanukkah, and carry from there all the way to the Gula Mitzvah Shlema. You're welcome. Good night.